Some people may wonder what makes ELSDs more sensitive than other ELSDs. And there is a big difference in performance between different ELSDs because they use different nebulization regimes, different light source wavelengths, and different detector types within the detector. So I'm going to talk about the SEDEX ELSDs and what they do because they're the highest sensitivity ELSD on the market. And the reason theirs is the most sensitive falls into a couple reasons. One is they use a blue LED. This is a 465 nanometer, 20-degree angle blue LED. And the reason they use blue LEDs in the 85s is because the photomultiplier tubes that they also use right here have a peak response at 420 nanometers. So these photomultiplier tubes are made by Hamamatsu, the only place in the world that makes them. They're not cheap. They're handmade in Japan, about 600 bucks a piece. In the quantities I buy them for are the detector within the set, all the SEDEX detectors. Well, most of the old ones. The newer ones I think have switched. But the photomultiplier tube, there is no better way at looking at small levels of light intensity than with a PMT. This is used for scintillation counting. This is used to look at interstellar space. This photo multiplier is what is the secret weapon to the SEDEX 85s. They get tremendous sensitivity at 5 ppm glucose, 1,000:1 signal to noise ratios with the SEDEXs, because the blue light of the LED is matched at 465 nanometers. It's close to the 405 nanometer peak response of the photo multiplier. So that's why theirs is very sensitive. Some of the newer designs, the newer SEDEXs, the 90s, use a blue laser instead of a blue LED. With a blue laser, you're at a 405 nanometer monochromatic light. A blue LED is 365 nanometers narrowband blue light, but it's blue. Blue laser's 405 nanometer, which is close to the PMT's 420 nanometer peak sensitivity. The photomultiplier tubes have peak sensitivity to blue light at 420 nanometers. So that's the theory behind the blue light. Some of the older ELSDs and some current product ELSDs use red lasers. This is an older Varex laser. It's very, from back in 1993. Red laser. Red lasers, they use photodiodes. And you'll typically see a photodiode in some of the newer detectors. Photodiodes are very good at detecting light, but they're not very good at very low levels of light. There's nothing better than a photomultiplier tube over a photodiode. So you have blue lasers, blue LEDs, red lasers, red LEDs, and last but not least, and not to be ignored, is a halogen bulb. The older SEDEXs, 55s, use a halogen light source. The reason the halogen light source was originally used, because we didn't have lasers and LEDs back then. They didn't have the proper intensity. But the original ELSDs, a couple of different brands, use halogen light sources. And there's a good reason for this, because a halogen light bulb has a broad spectrum light from UV all the way down to infrared. I mean, a halogen bulb gets really hot. I mean, you touch the glass, it'll burn you. And it goes all the way up to ultraviolet light. So it simulates the broad spectrum of the sun. So if you want true universality in your ELSD detector, broad spectrum light is ideal. A lot of the manufacturers have been switching over to these monochromatic light sources, these narrow band light sources like LEDs, and also they use the different detectors like the photodiodes and the PMTs. The thing is, if you happen to have a compound that absorbs in the red, if you have a red laser, you may not detect it. It may have a chromophore and it happens to absorb red in your red laser, you won't see the peak. And you could have a compound that absorbs in the blue and you won't see the blue. But if you have a good old-fashioned halogen bulb, which is broad spectrum light, even if you have a slight wavelength absorbance in a compound, you still have enough of other wavelengths to scatter the light. So interesting that we call ELSDs a universal detector, and yet going to the newer technology, LEDs and lasers, is actually making them less universal because the light being applied to the light scattering process is not broad spectrum like the sun or a halogen bulb. So there's some arguments out there, and I have even one client that swears he ran into both problems. He ran into a compound on one brand of ELSD that used a red laser, and he couldn't see the component until he went to a SETX 55, ran the sample on a 55, and he saw it. And then a few years later, he was running on another brand of detector that used a blue LED, and he happened to have a compound that absorbed blue, and he couldn't see it. And this is back in the combinatorial chemistry days when they were manufacturing artificial compounds. And he swears both in the red and the blue spectra, both 1 in a million things, it happened to him twice. In both cases, he resolved the detection issue using a detector with a halogen bulb in it. So it's interesting that the older technology is actually more universal than the newer technology. So that is why the different platforms are using different light sources, because A, they're reliable, like LEDs last 40,000 hours. A laser might last 5,000 hours, but a halogen bulb might only last 2,000 hours. It's about the lifespan, mean time between failures for a halogen bulb is 2,000 hours. But they're really cheap. This is like $2, $5 a piece, let's say. A laser might be $400 a piece. So, making money selling parts or trying to maintain universality of your detector, broad spectrum light is the way to go. So that's just a philosophical point that I see, with the older design and the newer design ELSDs. If we want to maintain the sense of universality, going to narrowband and monochromatic light is kind of working against the universality aspect. So going back to the good old-fashioned halogen bulb works wonders for some people. So it just depends on the compounds you're looking at. If you have a fixed sample and you don't have any of those issues, you don't have anything to worry about. But if you're looking for unknowns and you got random molecules being thrown at you and you need to detect them, there's that random chance that you might not detect it because that molecule absorbs a specific wavelength. This halogen bulb, you won't have that problem. Isn't that interesting? I think it is.